All right. Well, welcome to this session entitled Bridging the Digital and Knowledge Divides, Social, Ethical, and Legal Perspectives on the Internet of Things. My name is Esther Stein, and I work at the National Academy of Sciences here downtown. We have a great panel today. I want to call out first the organizer of this panel, Connie McNeely, who is at George Mason University and National Academy of Sciences. And she's a professor at George Mason University. Our panelists are Eric Killer, Julie Walters, Lisa Freehill, and Jong-On Han. And I will be introducing each of them. Each of the speakers have 12 minutes. And I want to say that Eric Killer is at George Mason University, and he will be talking to us about the panopticon effects of the infosphere, caveats and opportunities. Eric?
Okay. Also, I'm retired, so I don't wear jackets anymore. And I don't wear ties anymore. Okay. Could we do this as a slideshow? Okay. What I focus, whoops. Okay. What I focus on is on the intersectionality between the digital and knowledge divides and how they affect the well-being of underserved and undervalued communities and the world polity. And the title has changed slightly from what I had before, but I think if you focus just on the panopticon, it becomes a screed and it's not particularly useful. Next slide, please. Okay, initial thoughts. Since we have a lawyer on the panel, I thought we would start off with a quote from Ulpian. I will not read the quotes, but that one, I think is important. This was written in 533 in the Codex of Justinian. And these are the precepts of the law: to live honorably, not to injure one another, and to give each other his or her due. That is still current in the way we define jurisprudence. The second set of quotations are from Baruch Spinoza, one of the earliest philosophers of the radical Enlightenment. And what he focused on is, and I will not translate him, I did translate, all the translations are mine. So, you know, my Latin is rusty, but it's accurate, okay? My Middle Dutch is accurate. Every entity will try to persevere given the abilities that are innate to it. And he wrote this in both in Latin and in the early modern Dutch. Next slide, please. So the question that I propose, the proposition that I have, is that the digital and knowledge divides are intertwined. And they are critical. They really affect how we look at how we operate in the world polity. So the question is, how can we use IT technologies to help bridge the gaps between those who have and those who have not? The thing to remember with technologies, the instrumentality is important, but their neutrality is even more important. The technologies in and of themselves are neither good, bad, nor indifferent. So we know the effects of good or bad uses of technology. But for the indifferent use of technology, we don't know what they are. So we have consequences that we cannot control. A bad use of technology would be if, let's say, I use a sword as a plowshare without repurposing it. Next slide. This is straightforward. The digital divide, the knowledge divide we are used to. I use the term global divide because I find the term north-south divide to be condescending. We talk about that as if all southern countries are poor and all northern countries are wealthy. It's just, and the divide affects not only Virginia. Wythe is not as productive as Arlington, West Virginia. So the north-south divide, it does not work very well. I don't like the term first, second, or third world. That reflects more geopolitical ideologies than it does the actual geospatial or geoeconomic realities. Next slide, please. Okay, simple things to remember here. Information is straightforward. The thing to remember, information has matter and energy. All information does, and it has information, interestingly, as an entity, has a will to survive. You literally have to destroy it before it goes away. And this is one of the problems we have with the internet. There's so much garbage out there because we have trouble deleting it. Okay, Internet of Things, you use the term a lot, and it essentially means devices and embedded software, how they interoperate on an ICT-enabled network. The issue here is a network robust and is it trusted? The infosphere, cybernetic agents are human and artificial intelligence agencies that operate in the infosphere. The infosphere was a term that was first coined by Norbert Wiener in 1950 and 1954 when we start getting into the world of cybernetics. It's the book, his 54 edition, which I still read, and it's now Dogmark, I've read it so many times, it's still quite good. He rambles a bit, but it's still quite a good text. Next slide, please. This is my attempt at defining the infosphere semiotically. The thing to notice here is that I put the human beings in the middle. We are influenced by the infosphere, but we inform the infosphere as well. We create it. But notice that the infosphere is bounded by human society, culture and geography, law and justice governance, education, and so on and so forth, and healthcare, but also where it's bounded by morals, mores, and ethics and norms. Next slide, please. This is straightforward for those of us who work in the IT environment. This is a standard system development life cycle, and the points that I want to make with this slide are two. One, as we conceptualize our systems, we must build into those systems ethics, social well-being, and governance. Without those, we start getting indifferent effects. The other thing, and when I was leading programming teams, I emphasized feedback loops. Feedback loops tell you how your system is performing, how the AI agent is performing. So if you have self-referencing and self-correcting system, we can check how the system corrects itself. If we have to correct the system, we can assess what our conceptualizations are and what our hypotheses are, whether those are correct, if there's a system flaw. Next slide, please. What I'm worried about as a developer, and also as I'm retired, I'm a social scientist, is the biases that creep into software development. The critical thing, if you take anything away from this little talk, is biases cascade. If you think of one device introducing a bias, it's propagated to the next device, and it accumulates, and they don't cancel each other out. And if they do cancel each other out, you also have a problem because now you don't know which one to correct, and then it slips through again. So it's a very nasty, vicious cycle. And it's not a once only. It's a perpetual thing that you have to worry about. Okay, these are the critical ones. Algorithmic bias is the one I'm worried about. You can read them. There are a lot of them. These are all I could think of. Next slide. The power asymmetries. The IoT infosphere has a panopticon effect, which means all-encompassing surveillance. Good panopticon is, let's say, support for undervalued communities, telelearning, telehealth. Bad panopticon is, in effect, where a government agency goes after a minority population. If we look at such benighted regions as China, we have the Uyghur persecution, the Karen in Myanmar, in such benighted places as certain southern states in Africa, persecution of LGBTQ people and women who are seeking freedom of choice. Next slide, please. Okay. To fight all of this, there is a movement afoot to address and to ethics in the infosphere. The first set of ethics apply to entities in the infosphere. If you notice, they really focus on entropy, and they also mimic the second law of thermodynamics. The other set are moral human agents in the infosphere, and these are based on our normal notion of human rights. And notice that rather than entropy and those rights, we focus on freedom and equality and sociableness, the collaboration among people guided by self-interest. Next slide, please. Okay, the Mauritius Declaration that took place addresses even more, and it also focused on the infosphere and especially the IoT environment. And here, if you look at these bullet items, there are two things that stand out. One, it focused on the self-determination of human agents. And two, it focused on the integrity of the IoT of the cybernetic, of the artificial intelligence agencies. Next slide, please. Here is where we get into more interesting parts of where my work, where my research is. If we look at the quote from Grotius, one of the famous jurists of the 16th century, what he stresses in this quote is sociableness. He emphasized a world polity of nation states that participated in collaborative efforts, and those efforts were bounded by law. What he also introduced was this notion of natural rights, which were transformed by the United Nations and so forth into our concept of human rights. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The Human Rights Council tried to address rights in the infosphere, and notice what they did. Our offline rights are the same as online rights. So that's an important thing. Also, they stressed that we can use the internet for sustainable development and also to address issues of human rights abuses. This is directly as it comes out of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Next slide, please. Okay, in the world policy, we have a geopolitical and digital imperialism. We have these problems, and there are four of them that are interdependent. What it depends on is an hegemony of powerful nations and multinational IT companies. Well, we're focusing on IT now and ICT. So we have geopolitical imperialism, where a nation, 1 minute. Okay, so let's go through here. Next slide. Next slide, social determinants. We focus on economic environments, physical environments, cultural environments, personal circumstances. Next slide. This is based on Amartya Sen. This is if you are given a set of opportunities, you can choose how you're going to address them. You can convert commodities and services which need not be economic into your own capabilities to use those to live your life. Next slide, please. This is straightforward. We can skip this one. I want to leave you with this last quote. The first quote, and I'll read this one, I won't read the second one. A first-rate pilot, Kubernetes in Plato, or physician feels the difference between possibilities and impossibilities in his art and attempts the one and lets the other go. And then two, if it happens that he doesn't drop, he's equal to correcting his error. This is especially important for those of us who are researchers, who work with policy, and who work to make a better world. The second one applies to those of us who are project leaders, who are coders, who are developers in the IT world. We must build ethics into not only the hardware and software, but also into the network itself. Thank you for your thoughts. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for the rush.
No, that's fine.
I always create more slides than I got time to talk to.
Thank you, Eric, for a truly thought-provoking presentation. There will be plenty of things to talk about in the panel discussion that we will have at the end of all presentations. The next presenter is Julie Walters from Auckland University, and she is remotely joining us. and all seems to be in good shape. So I will pass the virtual microphone on to Jolie. Thank you, and thank you for joining us. Could you please unmute yourself? Perfect.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you remotely from Michigan. I'm going to be speaking as we had heard about issues related to the digital divide in relationship to the pandemic and shelter-in-place orders and intimate partner violence, specifically looking at digital help resources, with actually segueing off of some of what Eric was talking about, the digital divide being something of an issue there. So as part of what I'm going to be providing an overview on, I'll provide a little context, including some terminology. Then I'll be discussing a few representative digital resources supportive of intimate partner violence victim survivors, as well as provide some recommendations on what we've learned during this time period and policy recommendations, as well as in my conclusion, provide from issues for further research. I do want to add that in terms of the research with victims, survivors, some prefer the term victims, some prefer the term survivors. So I'll be using a hyphenated term, victim survivors, in respect for both of these stakeholder groups. First, very familiar terms, I'm sure, to many of us about the COVID-19 pandemic. So essentially, we're seeing the World Health Organization in March of 2020 declaring that we have a pandemic related to a particular coronavirus, and that triggered, as a public policy response in countries around the world, national and subnational governments, a number of efforts as to mitigate against the spread of this illness here. That included shelter in place, stay at home, or lockdown. You would see all of those three terms used, in which you would be ordered to stay typically at your home, unless you were an essential worker or needed to go out for essential supplies. These were often combined with other mitigating policy initiatives regarding mask wearing, for example, and physical distancing. Digital services refers to tech-based tools like online chat, text messaging, and video calls to provide services to victim survivors. Intimate partner violence itself deals with abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship, and an intimate partner refers to both current as well as former spouses and dating partners. This varies in severity and frequency, but it is equal opportunity across all ages, sexes, gender identities, race and ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, etc. Now, we know leading into the pandemic, the research indicated there were some factors that provide for enhanced probability of intimate partner violence, including social circumstances creating stress and frustration, personal perceptions of others as property, institutional features within one's community that actually basically ignore, are ambivalent towards abuse. So you can imagine that the circumstances of pandemic, and also thinking about shelter in place, as much as we have good policy initiatives trying to flatten the curve, we also have this issue, flatten the curve, meaning you want to not overwhelm your healthcare system by having too many people ill all at once, that these also have some unintended side effects. In this context of the pandemic worldwide, we saw that the United Nations Women published in April 6, 2020, that we had data coming in from around the world. For example, in France, the reports of domestic violence had increased by 30% since the lockdown on March 17th. So there are other examples, as you see on the slide, about these dramatic increases all around the world. And then we also, at the subnational government level, I'm just going to mention Jefferson County, Alabama in the United States. In the comparison between 2020 in March and 2019, domestic violence calls into that county increased by 27%. So we do have this relationship between well-meaning policy initiatives intending to try to flatten the curve and not overwhelm the healthcare system, but at the same time, we've got some unintended effects coming from that. Now, in terms of some common digital tools and policy goals, we see common policy goals associated with these tools, including access for victim survivors, safety, information and support provision, protection, prevention. Here is an example where I've just taken a screenshot from the National Domestic Violence Hotline pop-up to warn users who come to the website on the fact that their abusers could actually have access to information. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on best practices in just a a moment on mitigating that, because of obviously as a policy tool trying to provide services to victim services, you have a very big concern about what tool you're using and whether or not that's going to truly keep a victim safe in light of abuser access to digital tools. In terms of some of the most common tools that we see for intimate partner violence, I highly recommend the National Network to End Domestic Violence Tech Safety Net program. There's a lot of research out there in general on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and various factors related to that, interventions, counseling, that sort of a thing. But specifically on best practices related to how these tools are being used, I really highly recommend this organization. Platforms for hotlines and crisis response are commonly used for text messaging, online chat, or video calls. Video calls are also used for counseling and support services for victim survivors, and video calls for court and judicial issues. Once there is progression of a case within the legal system, that would be a separate presentation all of itself in terms of some of the aspects of digital tools and how the courts are using those and some of the limits and the benefits that have come from that. So the importance of digital tools for reaching out and providing services to victim survivors, one point, at least in the United States, and although I did provide global data before on the prevalence of during lockdown phases of these increase in domestic intimate partner violence calls, there is that we now find in the United States, Pew Research Center reporting that about 97% of Americans respond that they have mobile phones, and many of these tools can be accessed through mobile phones for victim survivors. Some more details on texting messaging. What we have seen throughout the pandemic is that there is benefit across many different age ranges. As time has progressed, we see that even older folks are actually aware fairly much around many issues involving the use of texting. I can personally attest to the fact that my parents, who are in their mid-80s, are active texters. All mobile phones have a texting application, so a separate download is not necessary. In this case, one big challenge, though, here is in terms of whether or not there is encryption of the data going across that. We don't have time to go into all the details of that, but nonetheless, it is an issue. For example, with iMessages on iPhones, there is encryption there, so there is protection in terms of the information that's going to and from the users. In Android messaging using SMS, there's no encryption. Now, sometimes those providing services have reported that some victim survivors preferred third-party apps for messaging. They need to be downloaded by both the victim survivor as well as an advocate in order to be used. They might be preferable, though there are some real concerns, again, about safety and security and privacy attached with these. Personally, I see Signal, because of its strong encryption, as being one of the strongest tools there, but victim survivors have reported preferences for using Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Snapchat, and some other types of platforms there. In addition, for web chats, video chats, and calls, two of the most common providers platforms are Resource Connect as well as Grooveo. The key here, though, is a matter of policy in instituting or recommending these types of platforms is data storage. How long is the data going to be stored, if at all? Is there a contract for regular purging in relationship to the usage? And again, encryption. From the abuser sense and that perspective, messaging and chat or other aspects of using a computer to access victim survivor resources, there is software that exists that abusers can get to trace keystrokes. So if you have the shared usage of a particular computer, you have an issue potentially of your abuser actually having this software that allows them to trace keystrokes and be able to see what passwords the victim survivor could be using to access resource websites and other things to help them. In addition, we have devices that are available that could be placed in a household for tracking messaged conversations that are happening on other devices. So it's kind of a central router situation, and it could be picking up what's going on among messaging and other devices. So really, the only real protection from abuser access is that abuser not having access to a device, but that's not really that realistic for many people. So again, this is a policy challenge in the future moving forward as to how to mitigate against that. In terms of access to non-provider apps that an individual could be, and oftentimes I find organizations and governments reluctant to recommend any particular particular brand, but these are some that I have seen mentioned before. Are You Safe, My Plan, both of these were instituted, but actually through nonprofits and or educational institutions. And then there's also Noonlight, which provides enhanced services, the free basic service, as opposed to the subscription, monthly subscription free. It's available on a number of different platforms. And what you do is on your phone, you would hold that little screenshot that I have there, that light blue button down when you are feeling unsafe. Then if you lift your finger or your thumb up from it, if you don't enter a PIN within a certain amount of time, the authorities are notified, and this is GPS associated, so they know exactly where you are, where the message is coming from, which mitigates against some problems that some jurisdictions have with their 911 call systems in the United States, and being able to locate a victim, survivor there under these circumstances. What are some recommendations, some select best practices regarding policy in the digital resource provision for IPV victim survivors? Cost benefit calculations. Not every jurisdiction actually needs everything that might be available. So if you're a small jurisdictions with a low incident of IPV, you may not immediately need to invest in a more comprehensive collection of digital services. In addition, you need to know your clientele and your constituency, which is related to the first one. It's sensitive, but you could potentially gather information informally among your provider advocates as to what those being served are preferring. In addition, victim survivor safety and security is paramount, as well as in training staff. In conclusion, the need for future research in light of policy, associated policy initiatives, the impact on digital IVP support tools of the increased use of home cameras and monitoring devices. We don't really have a great understanding in the context of intimate partner violence on the increased use of this, for example, during the pandemic. We need more information. Also, research needed on the extent of abuser use of tools to access victim survivor devices, what's going on with that. More research needed on the efficacy of certain digital tools for meeting specific policy goals. And we also have a need for more research on the diverse stakeholder groups and access to digital resources by type and preference, such as digital divide issues, digital poverty, race, ethnicity, age, LGBT, et cetera. And also, if a jurisdiction in the United States received COVID-19 support funds, how were they used in connection with trying to address any perceived weaknesses in IPV digital support tools? In short, we also would it would be nice to have a centralized portal, especially for small nonprofits and small jurisdictions to share information. And that is my conclusion. So at the end, as I understand, we'll be doing questions and comments. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Julie. Great presentation. I am taking some notes and I have some questions for later. So, I'm getting ready. Excellent. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is in the house, Lisa Freehill from Energetics Technology Center, and she will be talking to us about the Digital Divide 4.0. I'm curious about that one. Convenience, choice, and compulsion. Lisa?
Thank you. And thank you, Connie, for organizing this session. So Digital Divide 4.0, choice, convenience, compulsion. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you. So I'm going to talk first about the digital divide, what it is, why it's important for IoT, and then what I'm calling the 3 C's of IoT and the digital divide: choice, compulsion, and convenience. Next slide, please. So there's really 4 dimensions to the digital divide. And some of this based on the work by Bashko Chakrabarty, but there's infrastructure, inclusivity, right? So infrastructure is like the actual, tools and, the getting connected to the internet. Inclusivity really does deal with, who does have access to it. And then proficiency, which is, and there's actually 3 different broad types of competencies that OECD and the Department of Education have been looking at over the past about decade or so with the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, namely literacy skills, numeracy, and then a new one that they called problem solving in technology-rich environments. And then the last thing that kind of unifies all of these is policy. You know, policies can apply to all of those above things, but then also policy has to do with that balance of public and private interests, public goods versus the profit motive of advanced industrial capitalism. Thank you. So in the pandemic, there were a lot of realities about the digital divide that became wicked apparent, okay? And one of them was back before the pandemic, NTIA would do an annual, like their FCC reports, and they would show how much of the United States had access to broadband. And they tended to estimate something like 97% or 98% of the United States had access to broadband. Well, GAO sort of called them out on this with a report. And as a result of the report, they now use less flawed mapping techniques to do this. And this I thought was a really great illustration from the GAO report, showing, of course, that if you count any one household as having access in a county as then everybody's got it, you tend to overestimate how much access there actually is out there, right? So if you use a different system of mapping using polygons, you end up with somewhat more accurate estimate. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the other piece of that is it fails to account for cost, which varies greatly from location to location. So when the Census Bureau jumped on in and, into this issue, what we see here, the red shows you the sort of multifaceted measure of need, right, in terms of broadband. And what this takes into account are poverty rates, connectivity, rural and urban, all of those different factors. So only the green is really the areas where we actually have coverage. We know, for example, that tribal areas and rural areas really have some serious problems with respect to getting coverage. Okay, next slide, please. And of course, in the pandemic, what we saw was these problems of the digital divide became very apparent. What we see, if you remember, people were sitting in their cars at the public library where they could get access to Wi-Fi, or at their local school or something. You see down below, there's 3 kids. One kid is using a cell phone, the other kid is using the family computer, and the other kid is using a computer that they got from school to be able to do their homework, but they're all sitting right next to each other, right? So what we saw was that policy reacted very quickly. It was a very hands-on deck approach, all hands-on deck approach. So the FCC rolled out an emergency broadband benefit to people, which, by the way, is ending. The census implemented the new mapping technique that I showed you a moment ago. And then public libraries, at the time when the pandemic started, I was the senior statistician at the Institute for Museum and Library Services. Believe you me, the libraries jumped right into the fray and did an awful lot. And they did a lot in terms of providing devices to people. So they got a whole bunch of Chromebooks and worked with partner organizations, senior citizen centers and schools to make sure that the neediest kids got them. And then, go back, please. Yeah, one more. Yeah. So yeah, I'm still on this one. Sorry about that. So they had the Wi-Fi in the parking lots, they rolled out devices, but then the other big thing that they did was that they provided training to people. There are all these stories about people who couldn't get through on the phone to get their unemployment benefits. A librarian helped them, and the libraries figured out a way to get their computers available because we're also in the middle of the decennial census, and libraries were a key component of that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So problem solving in technology-rich environments. The way that the PIOC assesses this is through actual skills tests. So you sit down, you do an assessment, they give you a task that you're supposed to do, right? So it's not just asking you if you think you know how to do something. It's like, hey, can you do it? Can you solve this problem? And it's really consisted of knowing the technologies, understanding how to do it, and understanding how to frame the problem. Next slide, please. Go ahead and skip this one, please. Thank you. So in 2021, I think it was, the Census Bureau and Department of Education worked together and they rolled out a map system that you can now drill into to look at the US PIOC data on literacy and numeracy. And so you can see this, there's a real range. Most Americans actually have a basic level of literacy. Next slide, please. A little less so on the numeracy scale. And the next slide, please. It ain't available. When I was on the webinar and I asked the Census Bureau people or the education people, I said, hey, what about that problem solving in technology rich environments? Those of us interested in the digital divide are wicked interested in that dimension. And they go, we ain't got enough data to do the small area estimates to do it. In other words, there weren't even enough people in the US sample for the PIOC to develop enough data to map it using small area estimation techniques. Next slide, please. So that's a little alarming to me. So what are the 3 C's of IoT? Next slide, please. Choice, convenience, compulsion. You might think, well, it's all about this, right? Open the pod bay door. Hell, sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that. But this is not actually IoT. This is just a computer controlling a thing, right? Next slide, please. This is a little bit closer, right? This was in the news, the past several years about poor farmers not able to fix their tractors. So they're actually going out to auctions now and buying old tractors. So next slide, please. The IoT, as Eric was talking about earlier, has to do with, you've got a device, this is a physical device, and it's hooked up to the internet, okay? The most common devices that we see are climate control and the wearables, okay? And then we're starting to see refrigerators, and put the word smart in front of anything, and it's an IoT thing. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the slide I'm going to actually spend a bit of time on, because what Van Dersen and their colleagues have done is to really start to dive into the concept of what skills do you need to be able to operate in this Internet of Things. And so operational skills, do you know how to use the thing? Communication skills, do you know how to share that data with other people? Information IoT skills have to do with being able to make sense out of the data that you see. And then they actually put at the center these strategic IoT skills, which they refer to as taking full advantage of that data to achieve your goals. So and their research, for the most part, really focused on people who were already using things like wearables, which have to do with fitness goals, right, for the most part. So, and then what I've put at the center, though, is the privacy IoT skills. And I think for a lot of the reasons that Julie Walters was talking about, right, in terms of who sees the data and what are they going to do with those data? Are those data persisting over a long period of time? And the thing that's kind of alarming is that we don't even have like a basic rudimentary ability to work on the internet. Now we've got this whole skill set that needs to happen. But the thing with the IoT that is particularly troublesome in this regard is that because so many people don't have the skills, designers make it ever more easy to plug and play, right? And then these devices operate in the background, right? They're run increasingly by algorithms, as Eric was talking about earlier. And so all of those issues really come to a head with this, because folks can be very passive in their embrace of it, right? You're wearing your Fitbit, and where's that data going, right? So next slide, please. So the other piece of this too, so part of it is the skills piece, and that the digital divide in the United States, we can fix that infrastructure. We can fix, the issues with respect to getting devices out to people, right? The libraries, right, during the pandemic, they were figuring out all of that, but getting the skill set up, developing people's skills and understanding of privacy issues is a whole other can of worms. So we're going to see increasingly in the public sector, a drive for greater efficiency in providing services, right? This is going to be really important given the situation that we're in right now. And so there'll be increasing use of technology to deliver those services, similar to how Julie was talking about it. But then what are the implications of that? And then we're going to also see continued increase in remote work. The reason I put remote work in here is that this is also related to the digital divide in terms of occupations, because certain individuals have more ongoing experience with technology, with programming, with tech, and with computers. And it's that experiential base that Van Deurzen and their colleagues really cited as very critical to developing the skill set that you need to be able to navigate within an IoT. And then the private sector has a drive for profits. Increasingly, vehicles have controls, diagnostics, and telematics that, on the one hand, do benefit us. So we think, wow, this is a really good thing. But on the other hand, can be put to nefarious use. Health monitoring. Yeah, I'm not wearing a Fitbit anymore, but you can use a Fitbit or something like that. That's the most common IoT device right now. But at what point does that then become a compulsion? Oh, well, we're going to keep track of what you're eating and how you're eating it and stuff like that. It's the goes to the machine. And then environment and climate issues, right? So we're going to see increasingly that. So the bottom line, remember talking about the bottom line here, is policy. Again, I put policy at the center. I put the policy issues at the center of the measurement, because without a database intervention for improved infrastructure, increased affordability, and increasing proficiency, really that increasing proficiency, the evidence suggests that we'll see a widening digital divide over time. And I want to thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Another excellent presentation. And we are here at the almost end of it. And we have Jong-Gon Ham from National Science Foundation, and she will talk to us about the IoT of IoT. So I am pretty curious about this one. Jong-Han?
Hi. Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. And the first thing I'm going to say is give the disclaimer. Yes, I am at the National Science Foundation, but today I'm actually not representing the National Science Foundation. I'm on my own time. So please, I want to make sure everyone understands that my remarks should not be taken as representing or on behalf of, or, coming from the National Science Foundation first. Second, I'm thrilled at the end because number one, I could say ditto. And number two, I can also really stand on everybody else's remarks, especially thank you so much, Lisa. You've already, laid out what the problem with the digital divide is. We all know this. This is why we're in this room together and virtually. So the other thing, you will note that the IoT of IoT, having spent so much time with the National Science Foundation since I started as a reviewer way back in the previous millennium, there's some kind of a rule, I think, that everything having to do with NSF has to have a cute acronym or a cute title. So that's what it is. So for the impact of and to the Internet of Things, to IoT. So we've already talked about, the impact on the people who get access, and also to IoT from who gets access. How does, IoT change perhaps because who doesn't get access and whose views aren't seen? And I'm just kind of looking over the past couple of decades when we've had to deal with the internet and how things have changed. So I'm not giving slides, but I am going to talk about an effort that is coming from the National Science Foundation. And this is why I'm not giving slides today, because I'm going to be talking about a different directorate, actually. So, and if I can do this, if I can find this, where is it? Oh no, what happened? Okay, hang on for just a second. So I'm gonna go to here. So I am, this is the national, this is the, oops, what happened? Sorry, I know I shouldn't try to do this. So the National Science Foundation this year stood up a new directorate called Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships. And I'm going to try to find it. I'm very sorry about this. Here we go. Okay, here we are. Am I here? Yeah, okay. So this directorate, the budget for TIP is $865 million. And I'm sure some of you have probably already heard about it. I mean, you looked at this, but this is a different approach from what NSF has done before. It has always focused on basic research. But here, they are trying to do what you would call translational research, use-inspired and translational, trying to get from the basic research to things that hit society, hit market, have an impact. And so the reason I think this is a very, when something new starts like this, it triggers a lot of questions, a lot of ideas. And one of the major efforts of this directorate is to engage underrepresented, be more diverse in who gets to participate in technology, innovation, and partnerships. And so I'm just going to walk through here what's available. Some of you may have heard about some of the things already because they did have a very large notice about regional innovation. So for example, some of these, about half of the programs here are already moved over from other parts of NSF. So America's Seed Fund is essentially was SBIR. And I-Corps, which is Innovation Corps, people may know about them. So what I wanted to do in this session is for people to go to TIP, look at what they have available and what they're planning to do and what we can do here, establishing translation pathways, partnerships, and especially this, partnering to engage the nation's diverse talent, which doesn't have a program yet. If you were to think about in the past, 2 decades of IoT and how things have gone, and you could have made one contribution or one change or one something that might have impacted IoT for making accessibility, use, development more inclusive, more broadband, other than let's make it more broadband, let's make more devices available, let's set up policies. What would that be? So I just wanted to hopefully kick off this discussion because when a new program or anything gets launched and challenged, in the first place, a lot of the program directors are trying to desperately to not only field great ideas, but manage the money that they have. But if you would think about how you might present that as a new effort, a new initiative, especially in areas where this isn't something that happens every day. The map that Lisa showed about access, there's broad swaths of the country that don't have access. And until large scale efforts and investments are made, they're not necessarily going to get access. Is there a way that you wouldn't have to try to make, a large tech company, for example, make that investment to be able to bring that about in an innovative way, to have that access to these communities? there are also, when we talk about, academic institutions, and many of us are at academic institutions. I have very close engagement with them. Many of them are not in places where this academic institutions are abound, if I can say that way. Boston, the Bay Area, Washington. Sometimes it's the only outpost of activity that's going on in a region. And a lot of things can occur if those institutions are able to get some resources to carry things on, programs to make access available. And I talked about the academic institutions also because during the pandemic, the burden on all of those institutions was enormous. And so I would really like to get input from all of you, thoughts, ideas, maybe things we could do something a little differently to make things a little better in preparation for the next, big tsunami that tips us over as we try to keep the digital divide from widening even further and to, sorry, I can't get rid of these. Oh, okay. So I'm going to stop so that the questions can be shared with all of the rest of the panelists. And I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's questions and input. So thank you very much. And thank you for indulging me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much. I think this deserves a round of applause. So, and I would like to call the speakers that are in the house to join us here at the front. And thank you for those speakers who are virtually with us to be available for answers, questions. Apparently, we want also answers from John and Ham. So I want to kick it to first the public here in the house. Any questions? Larry. Yeah. Okay, another word. Sorry.
Is this working? Yes. So I have a two-pronged question about truth, which gets directly to both the divide and equality. And I'm speaking as the editor of a scientific journal. What I'm seeing is an increasing putting the burden on the user to understand what is true. So this is not about access. This is not about facility of using things. It's actually the ability to understand what is true and what is not. As we move away from what we might call authority figures, i.e. my scientific journal, to the whole gray area of predatory journals, and particularly the both educational divide and the age divide of people being able to actually evaluate the information that they now have access to. And people have talked about different parts of it, but it greatly concerns me. I don't see any simple solutions, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about truth.
Okay. It is Eric. This has been a problem that has been with us since the cuneiform days in the Mesopotamia. It's always the issue is because one can look at truth as being socially developed, i.e. we could see it sort of like George Gadamer. This is what we perceive truth to be because we agree this is truth. That is being challenged. The issue, and this is, I could not bring it out because I had too many slides. This is one of the issues that comes out with the paradox of IoT. It gives you so much choice and so many channels to find and define your own truth, that the only solution that I can see is in effect legal ones, where we say, or in effect, IoT does not lend itself as a device, in and of itself, as a device to find truth. So you have to go beyond IoT to, in effect, look at questions, how do we define truth? Your truth is scientific. You come out of science, I come out of the humanities. I'll give you a simple example. For you, the truth is Huygens or Leeuwenhoek or somebody. For me, the truth may be Kenneth Burke. It would be rhetorical truth. I mean, we get at the same solution. But it's also the Rashomon problem. We focus, we have a particular event, but all the witnesses have a different interpretation. So you cannot talk about truth as it being not only a semiotic act and a semantic act, but also it depends on who the observer is. And that makes it more difficult. The only thing I can think of making it work better is how epistemic communities govern themselves and how they propagate their standards to the outside world. One of the things I see in my profession as a data scientist, as an analytics, we have become a cult because we don't explain how our software works. And we revel in a particular patois, I'm also a linguist, in our particular language. The issue here is also truth is language bound. And I'm going beyond postmodernism here. Truth is language bound.
So the second part of my question is about the development of AI. Not only the chat, but the one I just read about yesterday in the paper of AI porn, of being able to create artificial realities that, and this speaks to Julie's comment, not only about truth, but even reality. And this is something that's being created and did not exist with cuneiform writing. So what do you see in the brave new world of alternative realities?
I'm afraid of that. Okay, if you want my unvarnished truth, I'm afraid of it because the way I think that in some ways technology started getting ahead of us. I read something yesterday in the New York Times where this writer was testing the new Bing AI approach, whatever, search bot, and this thing, the thing was trying to convince the writer that his wife didn't love him and that this creation called Sydney loved him more, and was trying to be a mind game with the writer, saying basically leave your wife and be with me. And it's fascinating art. And I think it's all these pitfalls of letting, technology getting ahead of us and governments relinquishing their role to the companies that put these things together without enough guardrails. So honestly, I think that the government should have a better handle on technology than what it is. Obviously, I'm not talking about myself and except asset, but in the interface between people and the systems. I think that that is the most unexplored way, the space in here, and is the one that can cause us more trouble, especially because of Earth 1 and Earth 2, that now is Earth 15. And as coming from the natural sciences, is this clash, because we know truth is a fold, is a geological fold, is a mineral, is a plant, is endocrinology, and then this other. So I think we are about to lose the battle if we don't get our pencils sharpened.
One of the things I'd like to remind people, if you're dealing with the technologies and computers, I know this is an old program, you're always one step behind. You're always one step behind in algorithm development. One of the big biases is obsolete data. You use obsolete data to build your data model. So the problem is that you're trying to say this is the problem with government. you're always one step behind. I do not know how you solve it, because this is an issue with a priori defining the conditions that make take place. That is just about impossible. The only thing you can do, I suggest, because the one of the things is with IoT and also with what we do with very large data sets, you can increase the rate of responsiveness so that you are not as far behind the curve. Because this is the truth, and you mentioned truth, you're going to be behind the curve with system development, with AI. I'm dealing with this as well with some of my work with NLP. Unless you normalize the dialects and so forth, you're not going to do it. You're always one step behind. You're always one step behind the semiotics. The language changes too quickly. Our notion of how we interact with each other change more quickly. The way I talk to my wife is much different now than 20 years ago. And I was there when DARPA invented the internet. I was programming that. So you're always behind. You can't talk to them. I always am a pessimist.
Any comments from the rest of the people here in the room or our speakers virtually?
I just wanted to say that actually policy is almost always one step behind. We're always chasing, reality. And two, even though, basic science research is conducted by people who are trying to, do something without in an absolute value way to how it might be implemented and used. And what we see here in this use of the AI porn is others aren't going to be using it in the way that it might have been intended to, when somebody's writing something, wow, that would be great, right? So the other thing, one more thing I just did want to say about the comment about truth. In the same probably news source, I read an article about a surgeon who had done frontal lobotomies because at the time that wasn't, that was the treatment. It was truth. This was how it's going to be. So truth changes. And I think that is going to be a continual struggle for all of us. Just think.
Yeah, I had a.
Yes.
Is it on?
Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Jose Hurtado. I'm a AAA's fellow. I work with Zhong Ang. I just had a quick comment about building ethics. There was a documentary on Netflix about gaming, and they mentioned about the experience of role playing a game where when they didn't initially have an ethical component to it, and how it kind of became really chaotic, and they had to go back and add the ethical component. So I don't know if you can talk more about that.
If I may respond, you raise an interesting point because I talked about the second law of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics, which means in effect that systems break down, the more chaotic they become. You raised exactly that point, and then you have to go through that loop again and starting it over.
Yeah. Lisa, do you have a comment? Okay.
I'd like to. Is this on? Okay.
Yes.
Hi, I just wanted to say that, policy isn't always just reactive. In fact, it's anticipatory policy, but you have to be able to anticipate what's coming. And there's so many things that are unintended. And don't forget that all the different kinds of biases that creep into these things too, and truth has always been relative, we know.
So thanks, Connie, because this will also, this is one of our continual discussions. Connie and I spend hours.
Thank you so much for your insightful presentations. Going back to what of our interlocutors here mentioned as well, I agree that policy can be ahead of a lot of things, but in the field of technology, because it's very fluid, policies often lag vis-a-vis, again, the fluidity that happens in the technology field, the ever-changing user behavior, technological transformations that happen sometimes overnight as well. I mean, I learn new technology every day. And back to your great point that you mentioned about some of the emerging AI technologies, talking about ChatGPT. It is also a generative AI technology. And I feel good when I'm, in a way, engaging with the technology as opposed to just descriptively following it. But it's also when we utilize technologies such as ChatGPT, learning and educating ourselves in the right way of how to ask questions, as opposed to just following these scripts that can be blindly followed sometimes, may lead us in the wrong direction. So I think education is also important when it comes to artificial intelligence as well. Just my comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, to add to your comment too, and we have to build out into machine learning efforts as well, so that it self-references and affect the ethical framework which bounds it. And this is, yes, I wholeheartedly agree with you saying. Yeah.
And there is a yet prerogative of the moderator here. I mean, and I want to bring, if possible, Julie to this, because this conversation, because she brought up something that other speakers sort of mentioned, but she brought it up in a more evident fashion, which is people who are in a position of little or no power, people who are in a situation of domestic violence, or I mean, which is compounded, something she a little bit alluded to, but I mean, I'm particularly sensitive, is we are speaking about this in English, okay? We may have been born here or not here, obviously I wasn't, but the thing is that all this discussion is happening in the lingua franca, which is English, but there are many people in our country and abroad for whom English is not their native language or the language in which they function completely. So with apps like what you were mentioning, Moonlight and other things like that, there is another step there, which is to have the fluency necessary to be able to use this, and the nuances of language and all these types of things. I mean, it's another superimposed barrier that's huge. The energy, activation energy to go over that is huge. So, and we know because of data and reports and studies that misinformation is certainly not limited to English, and is actually worse in Spanish. Here, at least in this country, is worse in Spanish. So I am native Spanish speaker, and it pains me because people who are not necessarily fluent in the lingua franca get the best of the worst of both worlds. So how do we manage this? So Julie has been working at that interface. So can I call on you, Julie, to?
You actually bring a very important point, because as I said, in the context of intimate partner violence, we're looking at really diverse stakeholder groups. And as Lisa and Eric had alluded to with the digital divide, this is a huge, huge issue here. Fortunately, my focus was on the pandemic and specifically certain policy interventions that seem to be also related to unintended negative consequences, such as the pressure that's put on a family when children have to learn remotely, and you have both parents home, the parents working remotely, additional stresses from that, control mechanisms, that sort of a thing. So that can happen at any socioeconomic status. It could happen, although basically people being able to work remotely and potentially have childcare, there was a socioeconomic status differential with some of that and types of frontline jobs where you did have to show up. But even then, if you got sick, you then had to come home and isolate. So there were certain circumstances that regardless of your background, you would potentially be experiencing intimate partner violence there. So the next question was, so there's an increased demand for resources, and Lisa was referring to digital resources, especially. Lisa was referring to the fact that you saw children that were working out of the back of a vehicle, or people parked outside libraries trying to access that. There's also the urban rural divide on this one, on whether or not you have broadband, and well, heaven knows Starlink, you know, you've got that coming into play. But ultimately, what we find is, especially with issues like domestic violence, intimate partner violences, we're looking at nonprofits working with the public sector. Okay, we need to move to our next panel. But my bottom line is we need to make certain that as we continue to have a drive of technological development, often driven by for-profit motives, the concern is how do we mitigate against that profit motive and trying to gain money from that context while still providing the protection for those who are in stakeholder groups that are not well represented in part of the digital divide. Thank you.
Fabulous. Well, Julie, thank you. Thank you to all our speakers and the questioners and the people in the audience. We need to close now because the next panel needs to get ready. So thank you for a really interesting discussion and have a good rest of your conference.
Thank you.